alright. We're fine here, cracking on with things. I said last week that I would be looking at doing these Heroquest figures this week, so I've set up my reference material here, my original Heroquest box art there, and the a printout from the Les Edwards Blood and Thunder, is that what it's called? Blood and Iron book. This is the Barbarian with his broadsword, and I'm going to be painting him over the next couple of days. So I thought I'd do this slightly differently. I thought I'd set up the camera to look over my shoulder and do a time lapse of painting him. But I'll just talk a little bit first about how I normally approach painting things. These will be slightly different because I'm working from very particular source art that has very particular source lighting and trying to match the colours quite closely. So I'll have to take a bit more care and time than I normally do over things. My normal process is to put on a base coat, then to wash everything, usually with a mix of these Army Painter quick shades and a sepia ink, a Vallejo sepia ink. And I'll be more or less doing the same thing here, and then I'll go back with the base colour, and then I'll go in with a highlight to try and pick up the high areas, putting them where the light's hitting, and then trying to blend them back. I'll put a bit of paint on the surface, and then I usually just sort of lick the end of the brush to get the remains of the paint off, and blend that across. But you can use a sponge if you're not so keen on licking your paintbrushes. I'm assured that these are inert and non-toxic. As I say, I'll be doing a bit more care where I put the washes and the inks and the highlights on these, but the basic principle I'm going to try and keep as much the same as possible. I'm using these Foundry paints, the Foundry paint system. I find them really good, both in terms of consistency and not having to mix too many colours, because they do such a range of shades. They're supplied in triads, so you get part A, a part B and a part C, and the idea is that you work your way up. You put on the part A, then you do base coat, you do a base coat of part A, and then you do part B over the top, which is slightly lighter, and then you pick out the final highlights in part C. I don't normally work in their triads, and I don't necessarily work in that way, but I like the consistency of the paints. They're a bit thinner than the Vallejo paints that I was using previously, and much thinner than the last iteration of the Citadel paints that I bought, although I haven't tried out any of their paints for about 15 years, so I'm probably well behind the times on that one. I tend to use the parts A and the part C. The part B is usually a bit thinner. It's usually a bit, the coverage is not so good because it's designed for sort of giving the blendable mid-tones rather than putting a base coat or a spot highlight on. So I don't get through the part Bs so much, but I'm going to be using a few for this. And what I've done is I've just gone through the range of paints that I've got, and I've held up these pots against the parts of the painting, and this is the array of colours that I think that I'm going to be using on this chap. Oops, he says chucking him around. So I'll just change the camera angle and we'll get cracking. Okay, here we go then. Nice hot cup of tea. That's very, very important. And here's my Barbarian. Oh, and there's my cat. Come and say hello, cat. Here's my little painting friend. Say hello. Nope, not going to say hello. It's almost 11 o'clock, so he wants his second breakfast. And I've got an elf here as well, so that I've got something to work on while the paint's drying on. Here, it's pretty dry and quite warm up in the studio, so it shouldn't take too long for paints to dry, but washes and things take a little while, so I have something to work on while I'm doing that. The reference material I've got here, this is the a printout of the artwork from the Les Edwards book, as I said, and the picture here is obviously a lot brighter than it is on the box art. I'm going to try and stick to the box art for colour and tone, because that's the artwork that I'm more familiar with, but this lighter version here helps to see what's actually going on, so useful to have that reference as well. Got my paint, got my brushes. I'm going to start off by putting my base colours on here. I've already undercoated them. This is a, I guess you would call it, what is it? What's the name they give it these days? A zenithal highlight, zenithal prime, or whatever you call it. It's something that I've been doing for a really long time before it was called zenithal, and ostensibly what you do is spray black and then spray white lightly over the top so that it picks up the top surfaces. And in a lot of cases when you're painting with inks and with thinned paints, that gives you your tonal values to work on top of. If you sort of spatter spray, if you get your upper spray so that it flicks bits of paint over the top of it as well, that can add quite a nice texture if you're painting orcs, goblins, trolls, that kind of monstery thing. Because I'm not going to be using this for my tonal values, because they're going to be indicated by the object source lighting in the picture, I just did this a very, very light zenithal, just so that it pulls out the detail, just so you can see what's going on in the figure. So this one I've started off with a brown, and then I've lightly, very, very lightly misted a white over the top. I normally go with a grey primer misted with a white for things that I want to be quite bright. For things that I want to be quite dark, or have quite sort of a high contrast or lots of armour on them, I'll go with the black, and then I'll do the zenithal misting with the grey, just so it pulls out the detail, but it doesn't brighten the miniature up as much as the white does. And I'm just using Poundland sprays. They do a matte black and a matte white and a grey primer, and that's all I'm using. I've used Halford's paints in the past. The brown that's on here actually is what do they call them? Molotow. They're a graffiti or an artist's spray. And when I did my sort of Nurgly orcs, they were a brown base with a sort of spattered green over the top, using those artists' sprays, because the colours are a bit nicer and a bit better. But for just the greys and the whites, the Poundland stuff is absolutely fine. So I'm going to pop in there, and then I'll set my audiobook off here. You won't be able to hear that. I'm going to speed this video up. If you're interested, I'm listening to Sorcery by Terry Pratchett. I'm listening my way through the Discworld books while on self-isolation, and so far that's where I've got to. And I'll speed the video up and we'll get cracking. Right, that's pretty much all of the base colours done and in position. I've just moved the camera there because I wasn't sure you were getting a particularly good view. It's hard to tell when I'm working here what a camera up here is seeing, so I've tried to move it down a bit more to my level. Hopefully that will give you a better sense of what's going on. So this is just block colours, and I've gone for a mid-tone for pretty much everything. I'm going to put a darker ink wash over the top and then start working back to bright. I've gone for jet black hair for the Barbarian because of how dark it is in the picture. I don't normally go for pure black. I normally use a charcoal black mid-tone there with perhaps a dark or a black ink over the top. There's a general rule in art that if you use black, it really deadens a colour, and if you use white, it does the same thing. So for shading and for highlights, it's better to use either, I tend to use a sepia to shade with, or if I want a cold dark colour, use a dark blue, like a Payne's grey kind of dark blue colour to give that shading. And for light tones, to highlight, I sometimes use a flesh tone or a bit of yellow, just to warm the colour up. But for this one, I'm going with black because it's very dark in the picture. I've also done a bit of a two-tone thing on the skin here, so where, I don't know if you can see there, but from the artwork, there's a very clear line of where the light is playing across the body. So I've gone for a buff leather colour for that upper surface, and the lower surface, if I can find the colour that I was using. What was I using? Is this rawhide. There you go, rawhide 11A for this underside here, but that will be darker with the ink washes over the top of it. And for the red on the elf's jacket here, I've just gone in with a dusky flesh. That's 6A, a dark brown there, but has a red tone in it. So I'll start to bring the red out of there. I think if you go in with a red too early on, you end up with a very deep kind of crimson colour, whereas the red tunic in this picture is quite muted until you get right up to the highlights. So I'm just going to use the red on the highlights there to introduce that. So I'm going to start putting the ink washes on. Just I'll mention the brushes while I'm here. I'm using Pro Art brushes. The biggest one that I've got is this one. This is a size 1 that I've been blocking the colours in with. Mostly I work with 3 noughts, 10 noughts and 5 noughts, mostly with 3 noughts, and then I'll use a 10 nought for the eyes and the very fine highlighting. I like these Pro Art brushes. They're not too expensive. They're synthetic, and I find that they hold their points really nicely. But I'm applying a very little bit, mostly on the end of the brush, and then I'll use a bit of saliva to lick that, and that helps to keep the point. You'll be noticing that I've been dunking my brush in the tea here. This is now a bit old. Here's my nice fresh cup there. I don't know whether the warmth of the water or the fact that it's tea, not pure water, so maybe there's a slight difference in pH value or something. I like to say that because it's not pure white, it helps give a nice earthy tone to the paints, but I'm sure that's complete rubbish. It's mainly just because it's there and handy. I don't recommend that you rinse off huge amounts of paint in your tea and then drink it. I tend to drink as much as I want and then leave a little bit in the bottom for washing the brushes off in. Right, let's get cracking with the washes. insert the inks on there. It's now much darker. Just did an overall wash over all of them with a strong tone, pretty much, and then with combinations of the dark tone and the flesh wash and a bit of the sepia ink mixed in, and just sort of picked out the dark specific shadow areas, and then I'll start going back in and lightening those up. So while that's just finishing drying, let's talk about the little lockdown competition or lockdown challenge that we started last week. So the challenge was to find the most horrible miniature in your collection and try and give it a nice paint job. So here's mine. It's not focusing on him. I'll take a photo of that and insert it in, but there you go. I still have no idea what he is, but I decided that he was a big hobbit, perhaps half hobbit, half troll. If anyone knows what that miniature is, or is supposed to be, do let me know. But there's my paint up of the most hideous figure that I could find in my collection. So send me yours for us all to have a good look at. This week's challenge: the oldest miniature in your collection. Sorry, I should rephrase that. The miniature that you have had the longest in your lead pile may not be the oldest miniature that you have, but the one that you have had for the longest and haven't painted. So that's my challenge to you to paint this week. I have got Grimbrondil, the White Dwarf. This one was the 200th anniversary, 200th edition of White Dwarf special release figure. You can see bits of paint on there. He has been painted before and has been stripped again and is back in my lead pile. So that's the miniature that I've had sat unpainted above my desk for the longest. So he's hopefully going to get some paint in the next year. Hopefully the next week. Next week. So that's my challenge to you for this week. Find the miniature that has sat in your lead pile for the longest, dig it out, and give it the paint job it deserves. Right. You can sit over there. So let's crack on with the highlights. Okay, so here's our painted Barbarian, and I've just popped him in the little diorama box that I built. I'll do an article on my blog probably. I've got some work in progress photos of this, and I'll just zoom out to show you. There we go, there's the other guys that I've finished so far. So there's the elf and the mummy and the skeleton and the chaos warrior behind him. More things to go in. There's the chaos sorcerer to go in here, zombies to go in down here, dwarf over here, orcs over here, and this setup was very much designed for one particular camera, and this webcam doesn't really it doesn't have quite the same lens on it, so it doesn't have quite the same relationship between the figures that the camera does. But it's quite tricky when they're all the same size, trying to get the perspective on this layout. If I try and move the camera so that you can see there's quite a big depth between where the barbarian is and where the elf is, to try and get him in the right point by the barbarian's leg there. And I've done this forced perspective on the tiles here, going smaller on the way back to try and replicate how they are on the picture. So I will get on with painting the rest of those chaps, and hopefully we'll have a progress update for you next week. So don't forget the challenge. If you've got nothing better to do with your time, stay safe, stay inside, and I'll see you next week. Cheers.